Welcome to our fourth and final panel here at the Honors Conference this week on gender, labor, and migration in a changing world. Each of the four theses that you're about to hear about engages with what I see as really classical sociological questions. Maybe I see that because I'm a sociologist. I'm sure there's lots of different types of angles and perspectives of the questions that these amazing scholars answer. But these theses in particular answer, how do large-scale institutions like states, law, humanitarian organizations shape the everyday lives of individuals? How do people, especially women, navigate structures of inequality as they move across borders in search of work, safety, or opportunity? Taken together, these theses remind us that migration is never just a simple movement of peoples, but a deeply social process embedded in relations of power. And let's turn to our panelists to learn some more. First, we have Sabina Toppel, Assessing Aid, the Humanitarian Response to Refugee Women Engaged in Sex Work. Tabitha Lin, Commodified Love, the Impact of Filipino Domestic Labor on Constructions of Family in Hong Kong and the U.S. Quinn Mai, Navigating the Unknown, Understanding How Somali and Vietnamese Immigrant Women in Minnesota Manage Uncertainty and Risk as They Settle into Their New Surroundings. And Ayola Fadahunsi, Japa Syndrome, a temporal framework on Nigerian migration to the United States from 1960 to the present day. Again, logistically, all four of these amazing scholars will present, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end after all four of them have gone. So write down your questions if you've got them. And I should say that these students may even be able to answer questions about each other's projects because they've been together for the entire year. These four folks were in my section of the thesis seminar and gave each other lots of peer feedback and know each other's projects very well, I'm sure. So nice to see you four together again. All right, and with that, Sabina, all yours. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Sabina. Today I'm presenting my thesis, Assessing Aid, the Humanitarian Response to Refugee Women Engaged in Sex Work. And before I begin, I just wanted to thank both my advisors, Professors David Pilati and Elena Shi, as well as my seminar instructor, Professor Pangborn. Thank you guys so much. So this project was kind of an attempt to examine the humanitarian aid sector and what it looks like to provide assistance and resource support to those who are affected and displaced by conflict and disaster. And I decided to zoom in on one specific population, which was refugees, specifically women who engage in sex work, partially because I was interested in the literature around sex work, but also because I think this case is a really interesting one to examine some of the critiques of humanitarianism, like humanitarianism as colonialism, or ideas about humanitarianism as charity. And so my big overarching research question was, what attempts are being made in the humanitarian sector to address the lack of resources for women selling sex in humanitarian refugee settings, like refugee camps? But I was also interested in examining some secondary research questions about like perceptions and motivations of humanitarian aid workers themselves. So like, how do workers perceive sex work? How do the organizations they work for perceive sex work? And in what ways or what is informing the way aid workers are actually working in the field? Is it their own motivations? Is it organizational attitudes? Or is it something else entirely? So this is a particularly relevant time, or obviously I would say this, but for this project, partially because this is a time of intense displacement and also like severe lack of funding, but because the humanitarian aid sector is really changing the way they approach programming for sex work in humanitarian aid settings. There's still like an intense resource gap, which is critiqued in literature and by nonprofit organizations and sex worker-led organizations. But in 2021, the UNHCR and UNFPA, which are the refugee and sexual and reproductive health agencies in the UN, respectively, produced an operational guidance document, which was the first comprehensive UN international humanitarian document that targeted specifically people selling or exchanging sex in humanitarian settings like refugee camps. And this was kind of like the only data point that I had from within the sector, and it helped me format my methodology and my research questions. So for this project, I used a couple different types of data, including examining primary and secondary sources about programming that existed already in my case study locations, but I mainly focused on key informant interviews. So I was interviewing humanitarian aid workers in the field from like international and local organizations. And the two case studies that I focused on were in Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya and in the Cox's Bazar refugee camp complex in Bangladesh. And these are also the three largest refugee camps in the world right now. But there's a severe lack of funding in all three of those locations, as well as like a lot of humanitarian settings. The duration of stay in these camps is pretty prolonged. There's clear evidence of sex work in both locations, as well as country laws that criminalize the practice and more general restrictions on refugee movement and employment, all of which can kind of push like people displaced in these areas into informal work settings like sex work. And I examined these by interviewing a lot of humanitarian aid workers, but mostly actually aid workers from UN agencies like the UNHCR and the UNFPA, to kind of get at both objective truths about what programming existed and what it looked like, but also subjective ideas about their own motivations or what they saw in the field. So my key findings, I guess I would kind of split up into two categories: what I learned about the operational guidelines themselves, and what I learned about humanitarian workers and the way their perceptions influenced their work. So the first thing I found out was when I was examining these case studies in Kenya, I found published existence of programming that targeted sex workers in refugee camp settings. But in Bangladesh, I couldn't find any evidence of this. And I was kind of like wondering why this was the case, or like, did programming exist? And what I found like pretty soon after I started interviews was that this programming did exist in Bangladesh, and it looked really similar to programming that was published in Kenya. And at first I was like, oh my gosh, the whole premise that I've based my thesis on is totally wrong. But I learned some really interesting things about the guidance document itself. And the reason why these programs look so similar was because they were both based off of this document that served as kind of like a blueprint for necessary services in humanitarian aid organizations that were supposed to be supporting this population. And then these were kind of tailored to specific, like context-specific issues. So this might look like if there's police violence that targeted sex workers, or if these camps were in tourist areas and how to deal with that kind of thing. And the interviews that I talked to in Bangladesh discussed how they didn't publish these findings because it was easier to do the work and perform the work rather than talking about it, because of stigma in the humanitarian worker population, stigma in Bangladesh, and stigma within the Rohingya refugee population that made up the refugee camps. And I also learned about in interviews that there was I talked to one of the people who actually formatted this guidance document, and they talked about how there was a disconnect between, in the creation process for the document, there was a disconnect between the way UN and government organizations wanted to frame sex work and the way sex worker-led coalitions wanted to frame sex work. So the original document was really about the language and the framing for programming that addressed sex work. And this document had to be iterated a bunch of times to make sure that it was actually operational and usable, and that it provided real frameworks for humanitarian aid workers to begin programming. And the second kind of key theme that I found was about humanitarian workers and how their own biases and perceptions influence their work. So this is kind of related to what I talked about with the guidance document, but a lot of my interviews talked about how sex work in the humanitarian aid sector used to be framed very much as a negative coping mechanism, something that should be eradicated, and something that aid organizations should kind of try to push refugees away from into other forms of livelihood. And this narrative, at least according to my interviews, has really shifted recently. There's a lot of training and value clarification exercises for humanitarian aid workers to examine their own biases and the way those biases impact their work. and the interviews themselves, they talked about how they would sometimes deal with ethical dilemmas, such as when they saw minors engaging in sex work. But they were like constantly examining their own priorities and using like organizational goals of destigmatizing services and increasing choice and agency, as well as like utilizing input and feedback from refugee women themselves who would like kind of pull them up on their biases. And that was one way that they found was really successful in combating this stigma. So although I think that my findings provided some really interesting answers to the set of questions that I set out to answer, I can't necessarily extrapolate them globally because I'm only examining 2 case studies. But a couple things that I found that I'll leave you guys with was like, I think it's really important to emphasize the like prevalence and like ubiquity of the guidance document and how it was used in multiple different contexts to as like a blueprint for programming. And I think the prevalence of the document itself showcases how necessary it is to include refugee communities, specifically refugees who engage in sex work, in the actual creation process of the document. And there was like definitely research within these communities in the program creation process, but they weren't necessarily key actors in like writing and formatting the document itself. And as this document like continues to be used in so many contexts, it's really important to be like constantly iterating it with the input from the communities itself. And this is my second finding is kind of similar, but even though there's like a really clear push for UN and international aid organizations to increase agency and to like promote choice in refugee communities, there is still definitely a lack of willingness to like give up international humanitarian power. And a lot of interviews and secondary literature that I read talked about how it's really important for these communities, like communities who engage in sex work, to actually be like driving these programs and leading them with like the backing and the funding of international organizations. But that isn't what's happening right now. And the last thing that I'll say is obviously this project has really changed recently under the Trump administration with cuts to USAID, which helps fund the UN, which helps fund like major international nonprofits and NGOs. So the future of this programming is really unclear. And there's like an entirely new resource gap that the humanitarian sector is going to face. So even though I'm recommending these next steps, what's most important is actually keeping what's there now available to the population. Thank you, guys.
Hi, everybody. My name is Tabitha. Thank you so much for being here today. I'd like to start by thanking my thesis advisors. Thank you, Professor Baldos, Professor Lina Weaver, and Professor Nicole Pangborn for all of your support this past semester. I'd like to say that I'm so excited to be here today amongst these 3 other panelists. We've been together, as Nicole Pangborn said, for the entire year, and I'm so proud to be here with you guys today. So without further ado, I'm here to present my thesis, Commodified Love, the Impact of Filipino Domestic Labor in Hong Kong and Constructions of Family. So to start, I wanted to give a very brief overview of the important literature that led to my research, as well as why I chose my case studies. So my thesis is focused on the global migration of domestic care workers. So when women migrate from the global south to the global north to care for the other people's children, and in doing so, they leave their own kids behind. So this transfer of labor is what people call the global care chain. It's the idea that labor is passed off from wealthy families in the global north, then to a migrant from the global south, who then must pass on the onus of the responsibilities of care for their own children to poorer laborers and family in the global south. So this chain is what defines my thesis, and it is defined by gendered and economic structures of inequality across the global broader economy. So my thesis focuses specifically on the Philippines as the source of this global care chain. 8.8% of the Philippines' GDP is actually reliant on remittances, and over half of these migrant laborers are women. This, coupled with global stereotypes that position these Filipino women as inherently docile and caring and obedient, means that migrant domestic workers in the Philippines are considered what they call like the Mercedes-Benz of international caregivers. I'm focusing specifically on these migrant caregivers to Hong Kong, and there's several reasons for this. But one of the biggest reasons is because over 10% of Hong Kong's workforce is actually made up of migrant domestic workers, and over half of these women are Filipino. So there are currently over 400,000 workers in Hong Kong who work as domestic workers, and half of them are from the Philippines. And every Sunday afternoon, if you're in Hong Kong, you will find them crowding parks and metro stops in any public space because they have no space of their own. So one of the most salient reasons that I ended up choosing Hong Kong was because of the specific laws that have emerged in response to this high population of migrant workers. And in the interest of time, I'll only be speaking really to one of them, but the one I will be talking about most is the live-in law. The live-in law is the idea that these migrant workers are forced to live in with their employers, regardless of how much space they're afforded. So they're required to live in the house, which in Hong Kong is an extremely, really dense city, which means that the average space for a family is around the size of a 2-car garage, meaning that workers are forced to sleep on couches, to sleep on hallways, just to share rooms with children, or if they're lucky, they're given small accommodations like shown in this picture to my left. This can lead often to abuse and exploitation where workers have no separation from their workplace. This leads me to my research questions. So I'm looking at both the household in the Philippines and in Hong Kong. My first question looks at how migrant domestic workers navigate and maintain connections with their transnational children while working abroad. And the second question looks at how the presence of a migrant domestic worker influences family dynamics within the household they work for. So that's the household in Hong Kong. And finally, I hope to answer both these two questions through the lens of law. So how does Hong Kong's legal system shape the relationships of migrant domestic workers? To actually answer these questions, I conducted Zoom interviews with migrant domestic workers in Hong Kong. So I interviewed 10 domestic workers, all of whom had worked in Hong Kong for over 2 years, and 9 of whom have children themselves that they left behind in the Philippines. Their stories really drive my thesis, and I will be sharing their stories in the next 2 slides of my results. So I'll focus first on the Philippines and how mothers maintain these relationships with their children left behind in the Philippines, and how the law plays a role in these avenues. So all three of these are driven by these gendered expectations of motherhood, where there's a pressure for mothers to provide both the economic as well as the emotional support, even despite their distance. So identify 3 different ways that they do so. The first is digital communication, where they're calling and texting the children in the Philippines. Second is gifting, where they're sending remittances and gifts back home to their children. The third is what I call transferred motherhood, where they treat the children that they care for in Hong Kong as they would want to treat their own children in the Philippines. I'm not actually going to read these quotes, but I really invite you guys to do so because I think they really substantiate the claims that I'm making. But I argue that each of these avenues are either strained or reinforced by Hong Kong's legal system. So where migrant domestic workers rely very heavily on digital communication, so calling and texting, long working hours that are perpetuated by this live-in law and other similar laws can make it very difficult to call home and further strain these relationships. My second case, gifting, is made more difficult by the law's low minimum wage. So this can serve both as a coping mechanism for workers to alleviate the guilt they feel for leaving their children behind, but it can also be a source of potential further emotional strain when they cannot provide what they want to or what they are expected to give. And finally, I argue that transferred motherhood is both reinforced and produced by these legal systems. So the live-in law and other laws blur this line between home and work for these workers, and this persistent intimacy that is between them and the children they care for compels workers to treat their wards like they're their own. Turning to the other side of migration, I will speak to the tensions between mothers, children, and migrant domestic workers that emerge within the Hong Kong household. I'll be using the term wards to refer to the children they care for because that's what they use themselves. This constant proximity that I mentioned before between caregivers and wards can create really deep bonds between them, but complex dynamics can then emerge between these 3 people that I mentioned earlier. So I'll be presenting these findings kind of in 3 major themes. The first is like family. I found that in many ways, workers treat their wards like their own children. They raise them like their own. They love them like their own. They even often spend more time with these children than their own parents do. And these intimate relationships are developed by the live-in law and other similar laws where wards actually have to share rooms with their migrant domestic workers. And some were telling me stories about how they fall asleep with their wards in their arms every night. So this close relationship, in turn, can produce jealousy from the mother and thus a complex relationship and tension between care worker and mother. So this leads me to my second theme, which is jealousy of the mother, where workers must navigate adequately caring for their wards, but also managing the feelings of the mother, where not adequately managing these feelings can lead them to losing their employment. Finally, my last finding also speaks to this relationship between care worker and child, but complicates our understanding of this loving mother and child-like relationship. Workers shared with me that despite their wards loving them like parents, they often do not just respect their labor and delegitimize it. So they do not listen to them and disrespect them in public. So while loving relationships do emerge between children and their care workers, they are still tainted by this underlying economic exchange that prevents workers from feeling like they fully belong in this household that they work for. So what is the point of all of this? I argue that scholarship on interpersonal relationships should consider the impact of legal systems. The law should not just be a background condition, but rather an active agent in structuring these care relationships. In a more practical sense, my research suggests the potential to reform Hong Kong law has the ability to protect against not just overt exploitation, but actually how workers are able to maintain these relationships with children in the Philippines and children in Hong Kong. So this has to be done in multiple different avenues, but I identify three. So abolishing the live-in law, protecting against working hours, and ensuring a higher minimum wage is a way to start. So I've spoken in length today about how domestic workers have been exploited and overworked and stripped of their agency under Hong Kong law. But I left each conversation not with pity for these women or for their situations, but rather with an impression of women who lead abundant lives and have very clear passions outside of their work. And it's because of this that I'd like to end with a quote from one of my interviewees. And so when asked if there was anything that she hoped to relate to other domestic workers, she shared with me the following. When they go abroad, they should not think about their families back home. Of course, it is their priority, but also to think of themselves as well. If they have the opportunity to become better, to build a stronger them, to build a different them, and be back home differently, then they should take that advantage. They should take that opportunity. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for being present today. My name is Quinn Mai, and I would like to start my thesis presentation out by expressing deep, great gratitude to my thesis advisors, Professor Schiller and Acosta, and also my seminar leader, Professor Pangborn, for their guidance during this process because it's been lengthy and also a whirlwind of experience. Today, I will be discussing the integration experiences of refugee women in Minnesota particularly. I chose this topic because I was once a refugee child, and I've seen firsthand how these resettlement processes and policies impact the women, especially because they are the pioneers of resettlement experiences and of their family, because they take care of the homemaking, they take care of their children, and so it's a really important topic to me personally. Additionally, more people than ever are being actively displaced, as we have seen in the news and in the statistics, and therefore it's even more pressing now for us to understand all aspects of migration, including resettlement. So these are my research questions. You can read them, but currently now, the available research mainly focuses on the economic and financial markers of success, and often at the national and international level. My focus is to instead give equal attention to all facets of integration and resettlement, and to do so on the state level. By investigating holistically the experiences of women from two different groups, Somali and Vietnamese, but living in the same area, which is Minneapolis, I can better analyze the effectiveness of the state and local resources. I will condense my literature review to two areas. The first are the studies conducted by Agar and Strang, and basically they were really instrumental for organizations and also scholars to better understand and measure integration. And so this figure is just a summary of what they found and kind of the components of integration. Additionally, I rooted a lot of my work on available feminist migration theories, and they really challenged the current available migration literature because they analyze how women experience burdens differently. One really important example is the phenomenon that's called double shift. And basically what that means is that women who have salary-paying jobs outside of the home come home and experience a second double shift or a second work shift because they have to take care of the children and they're in charge of the homemaking. And basically, it's a very unequal balance of the share of work in the home. So methodology, mine was really rooted in semi-structured interviews of 16 women, so qualitative. And I interviewed 8 from Somalia and 8 from Vietnam. And my kind of baseline to start was to have them 30 years old or more, because I wanted them to have sufficient experiences in both countries, in their home country and also the resettlement country. And after I did that, I interviewed them, and then I typed everything out into a Google Sheet, and then I coded them myself so I can like start to identify patterns and also make the analysis much easier. And that's just a small snapshot of what that looked like, what that kind of like document looked like. There were 3 really crucial findings. The first is the expectation reality gap. And basically, these women would tell me stories of how they experienced a lot of shock when they first came, because the families they had abroad and the friends they had abroad would reassure them of the life in America and how great and bountiful it was. But when they came here, obviously that's not true. And there was a lot more barriers than they were told or expected. And so they felt that it was really like the dishonesty about the realities of life was really shocking and off-putting, because now they felt like their integration process and experiences were much harder because they didn't foresee these, or they just kind of overlooked these certain barriers because they were never brought up, or they were just kind of like not like their families and their friends would just say, oh, that's not a thing. Like, you'll be fine in America. Like, it's so much better in America. And so, you know, they obviously were not happy about this, but surprisingly, as the interviews went on, it was revealed that they themselves reproduced this cycle, because there was this culture of shame and embarrassment from not being able to achieve the American dream. And so, you know, despite them not appreciating or not liking the expectation reality gap, they also reproduced it. And so that was a really important finding. And then the second is the prevalence and the prominent role that parent-child role reversals played. And basically that happens when children take on roles and tasks that really their parents should be doing. So some examples from my interviews is that they would have to file paperwork, very legally dense paperwork for the government. They would have to take appointments for their families, read the mail, et cetera, et cetera. And in the literature, one of the reasons why I found this really interesting is because it's also reflected in the literature, because they found that this happened more in women, and especially between mothers and their daughters, than in men. And so this caused a really massive mental strain on the children themselves and also their confidence. And one of my interviewees even cited that she experienced and developed anxiety from this experience, something that is, still really prominent in her life and she's still grappling with today. And the third, and very interestingly, are the community-specific impacts, and basically how nail salons for the Vietnamese community facilitated integration differently than the community centers and mosques for the Somali community. And so just a little quick background, nail salons and the Vietnamese community in general has this monopoly over the manicuring system and network in America, because they set up this elaborate and successful system after the fall of Saigon, and then there was a mass exodus from Vietnam to America. And manicuring was one of the things that they were able to set up a very efficient system of having training in Vietnamese and then straight into job placement. It was very quick. The training was short, very inexpensive to get into. And so women who were in this system, the Vietnamese women, it was easier for them to find jobs, to also relieve their financial burdens quicker. And also they had access to the social network of other women with similar backgrounds. And therefore they could ask them, where's the nearest grocery store that had, Asian ingredients, or where should I send my kids to school? And they were also learning the language faster because it was an economic setting. And then for the Somali community, I found that most of them used community centers and mosques as a way to facilitate their integration. And while it was a slower process of integration, they were able to invest in their long-term skills. So interviewing, how to apply for jobs, how to work in specific settings, like being a secretary. And so because it was less rigid, more women were able to attain higher education. Whereas in Vietnam, like with the Vietnamese community, the allure of cash flow and also the historic and long established network that's already there and available made it less appealing for them to get a higher education. And so that's one of the positives about the community centers and community-based networks. However, because of the nature of it, despite the positives, it's also a high risk, high reward, because not even half or not even the majority of women are able to attain higher education because they are bogged down by the financial burdens when they first come in. And so it's, there's positives and negatives to both. So just to wrap things up, it's really important that we talked about the six-pronged approach, which is how all of these women kind of framed their experiences around. And basically, this is just a more concise but still holistic framework for understanding integration compared to Agar and Strang, which I think is more effective for future organizations to use because it's easier to understand for everyone involved, but it still is a holistic view. And I recommended that in redesigning programs or designing programs in state and local resources, I think that they need to be very language accessible. That's part of the reasons why the Vietnamese nail salon community worked so well in integrating their community is because everything was in Vietnamese. They didn't need to learn English. And so I think the Somali community would also benefit from something similar. And then also having youth-specific resources that will anticipate and combat against the childhood role reversals. And then also partnering with non-traditional organizations like Buddhist temples, mosques, and also nail salons, I think would help better integrate new communities and also just make it more effective and more human-centric. And just to end off everything, I want to just remind everyone that, refugees and refugee women, they're not financial entities as they're often depicted in scholarship. And so they also deserve to, have chances at attaining higher education and not just focus on what they bring financially or what they can get financially, since that's a big focus on scholarship is that, oh, they're coming to the US. It only matters if they're financially stable here, but that's not true because they're whole human beings and it's not just the financial aspects that impact their quality of life. Thank you.
Hello and good morning. My name is Ayola Fadaunsi. I wanted to start this presentation by saying a special thank you to my thesis advisors, Dr. Daniel Smith and Dr. Victor Allerby. I would not have gotten here without you all, and I'm so truly so grateful. And I also want to thank my seminar instructor, Dr. Nicole Pangborn. I'm so grateful for your care and devotion to all of us and bringing us to this place. So thank you all so much. When I introduce myself to people, I often tell them that I am Nigerian American. I mention this part of my identity, being Nigerian, because it was crucial to my identity growing up and also crucial to my pursuit of this thesis and this project. My background as a child of migrants with parents who often opened our homes up to other Nigerian migrants, helping them get on their feet when they arrived in the US, I saw firsthand that migration is both a collective and individual story and experience. And thus, I sought out to explore the evolution of Nigerian migration from 1960, which is when Nigeria gained independence, till the present day. Further, I wanted to specifically explore the new phenomenon of Japa syndrome, which I had been hearing so much about. So Japa syndrome is explained in the translation of the word. Japa is a Yoruba colloquial term that means to flee or to escape. In recent academic literature, many Nigerian youth who were interviewed have utilized the term to explain that Nigeria is no longer conducive to socioeconomic development and social progress. And what that means is that in Nigeria presently, because of government instability, lack of job opportunities, and also inadequate education systems, many youth in Nigeria do not believe that can have social upward mobility, and thus they're stuck in waithood. And waithood is very prevalent and a key part of this Japa syndrome phenomenon overall. In order to analyze Japa, though, I didn't want to only focus on the present. I wanted to create a multi-generational temporal framework of Nigerian migration. In accessing Nigerian migration from 1960 to the present day, I was able to gain a more holistic view of how Nigerian migration has changed from independence till the present day. And thus, I sought out to answer the following questions. How have larger socio-political context in the United States and Nigeria shaped individual level motivations of Nigerian migration to the United States? What has caused the recent phenomenon of Japa syndrome? And how have motivations of migration changed in this new temporal period? And lastly, how has the lived experience of Nigerian migrants in the United States changed from 1960 to the present day? So why is it important to research Nigerian migration? And what does this research mean within academia and in the current socio-political sphere and to the individual? So in researching Nigerian migration to the United States, I sought to foreground migration research within individual narrative experiences. And through the primary data collection that I gained, I was able to gain firsthand accounts to Nigerian migration in the United States. Further, this research contributes to academic research on migration trends in Nigeria and sub-Saharan Africa at large. What I found in my literature review of both sub-Saharan African literature and Nigerian migration literature is that Japa syndrome, which is this surge in outmigration of young people from sub-Saharan Africa, is not limited to Nigeria alone. This phenomenon and this trend is happening all across sub-Saharan Africa, which showcases the pertinence and just the importance of studying this phenomenon in the present day, but also utilizing historical lens to understand it greatly. And lastly, the temporal framework that I've been mentioning is not seen in many academic literature that I was exploring. So as I was reading all of this literature, I found that they were only focusing on the present day. What is happening in Nigeria, for example, or other sub-Saharan African countries, and then also what are the migration conditions in the US, for example, or the UK. But I wasn't seeing anything about the histories such as like colonial history or histories of what was happening in different countries. So that's what I sought out to do in my research study. So you've heard about what Japa means and how this thesis contributes and seeks to add to academia. Now I'm going to explain what exactly my process entailed. So in constructing my research design, I utilized a temporal framework, like I mentioned, with 3 periods. So period 1 ranges from 1960 to 1989. So 1960 is when Nigeria gained independence. And I capped it off at 1989 because there was a significant change in US immigration policy in 1990 that I thought impacted the temporal period 2. So temporal period 2 is from 1990 to 2017, and the 3rd period is from 2018 to the present day. With these periods, I included socio-political context in the form of major events, conflicts, economic increase and declines in Nigeria, and I paired this with context of the current immigration policy in the United States. And what these historical framings serve to do is to showcase a comprehensive view of the immigration conditions of a Nigerian migrant who came to the US during that period of time. So what exactly was happening in Nigeria? For example, in period 1 and in period 2, there was a civil war in Nigeria. And with the civil war in Nigeria, there was an increased outmigration of people from the Igbo ethnic group. But in the United States, there was a 1990 diversity visa, which increased migration access to the United States. So in framing the view of migration in a more global framework, I was able to see that different mechanisms, push-pull factors, if you will, from both Nigeria and the United States, either facilitates or inhibits migration to the US. So the last component of my historical framings were the qualitative interviews themselves. So I wanted to have a multi-generational interview of migrants from 1960 to the present day. People from 1960 are a little bit older, but I was able to find people who came here in 1980 till the present day. And in talking to these migrants and pairing the socio-political context with their individual stories, I was able to see that yes, policy both in Nigeria and the United States does impact migration. I also spoke to Nigerian nationals in Nigeria presently because I wanted to get their Nigerian youth. I wanted to get their perspective on what is Japa syndrome to you? What does it look like presently? And I know a lot of people in Nigeria shared with me that they turn around the next day and their friends are gone. People are constantly leaving the country, and that is a reality for a lot of people living in Nigeria presently. And I also talked to a Nigerian migration scholar who researches Nigerian migration and is based in Nigeria and does this work globally. So in talking to all of those people and with this historical framing, it was all very helpful in coming to my findings. Okay. I was led to many findings in this study, but today I will share 3 main findings. Number 1, Japa syndrome is a result of compounding socioeconomic and political downturns in Nigeria. In my thesis, I titled each period with its own theme. So period 1 was the era of potential. In period 1, Nigeria had just gained independence, and it was an emergent nation filled with a lot of potential. There was an oil boom, so there was an economic boom, and there was a lot of hope and prosperity for a future of Nigeria to come. Unfortunately, with period 2, we saw the aftermath of a civil war that really impacted the economy, impacted morale, and impacted just the quality of life in Nigeria. And because of the military coups and counter coups, we saw a lot of outmigration of Nigerians. And in period 3 is the era of Japa. From all the interviews that I conducted, a literature review on Nigerian and sub-Saharan African migration alongside contextual framing, I found that there is a general sentiment of a decrease in hope that Nigeria will, come back to prosperity or that things will change, especially for young people in the nation. Finding number 2 is that U.S.-Nigerian migration is facilitated by education-based pathways to the United States. In 90% of my interviews, Nigerian migrants mentioned that they came to the United States through education pathways. So whether that was through fellowships from the Department of Education in the U.S. or through PhD, master's, or bachelor programs. This finding is supported by the literature and also Nigerian migration demographics in the United States. According to the Migration Policy Institute, 37% of Nigerians hold a bachelor's degree compared to the 20% national average, and 29% of Nigerian migrants hold a master's or PhD or advanced degree compared to the 11% national average. And what these numbers show is that Nigerian migrants are utilizing education-based pathways to come to the US. And finding number 3 is that push-pull factors of Nigerian-US migration span across periods. So what I found is that the nature of individual level motivations of coming to the United States did not change in nature, but there was one significant change in the period of Japa itself. And that change was the increased use of social media and information dissemination. Essentially, in analyzing my thesis, I utilized migration systems theory, which suggests that migration is facilitated by a system of exchanges, whether that's exchange of money, exchange of information, exchange of education, for example. So with this increased exchange of information from 2018 to the present day, migrants are able to know how they can migrate to the US, what life looks like in the US, and that has contributed greatly to the increase in Japa syndrome. Okay, sorry. And lastly, So I've talked about all of this, but how does it all translate to academia or the world at large? What does it all mean? I found 3 main implications. Utilizing the temporal framework allowed me to gain a comprehensive perspective and analysis on how Nigerian migration changed or stayed the same from 1960 to the present day. And I assert that this incorporation of this framework in migration research will allow other scholars to notice trends over time and how history shapes present topics that they might be exploring. So this thesis showed me how and why it is important to have a more comprehensive view of migration studies. Next is that sub-Saharan African literature shows that Japa is happening all over the region. So it is important to continue research on, migration and Japa syndrome, not just in Nigeria, but in other countries as well. And on a universal and global scale, it would be a disservice not to discuss the current political state regarding migration, not just in the US, but globally. There's an increasing wave of anti-immigrant narratives and sentiments, but through research that highlights individual level experiences and uplifts the voices of migrants, I assert that work can be done to bridge the gap between humanity and migration discourse. And it is imperative to infuse humanity back into the discourse on migration. Thank you all so much. And a special thank you to my friends who are here today and my family, and to all fellow thesis writers.
Fantastic work, all 4 of you. I'm so proud of you all. I would love to kick off the Q&A with one question for all 4 of these panelists and then open up to the audience here. So my question is related to the fact that all 4 of your projects have involved in-depth interviews. Sabina, you interviewed humanitarian workers in 2 different contexts. Tabitha, you interviewed Filipino migrant domestic workers who were working in Hong Kong. Quinn Mai, you interviewed 2 different groups of refugees in Minnesota. And Iola, you interviewed a range of migrants from Nigeria over a few temporal periods. And so interviewing, of course, is like a very time-intensive, rich process of acquiring data, but also involves a lot of emotional work on the part of you all in conducting these interviews. So it makes sense that you have to be selective about the sample that you're choosing. And I guess I'm curious to hear you all reflect on if you had time to write another chapter and gain another perspective that you kind of started to feel would be really important perspective to add to the story that you're telling. What perspectives would you seek after, or would you seek first, and why?
I can start. This is a good question. I feel like I have a lot that I wish that I could have done, partially because of like time constraints and also just like my own expertise. I think something that like when I was starting out, I really wanted to interview like local humanitarian actors, which was a lot harder to get to than international humanitarian actors, partially because of like language barriers, but also because like those were the people I was connected with first. And then it was like harder to kind of go from there. And I think that's like a really important perspective that my thesis is missing a little bit. I also, when I started out the project, really, I like wasn't thinking of it from the lens of aid work, but I was thinking of it more from like the experience of refugees who were engaging in the programming themselves. But I don't really have like the expertise or the resources to do that. And so if someone else were to do this research, that's what I think actually would be the most important, but wasn't necessarily within my own capabilities.
Yeah, so I think that similarly to Sabina, I started off this project with a lot of different people that I wanted to talk to. And because of time constraints and other reasons, it ended up just being one specific group. In the beginning of this project, I was doing like a comparative analysis between Hong Kong and the US, and then I ended up dropping the US because of several different reasons, one of them being that I couldn't reach people in the US. So if I were to had another year to do this, or if I were to do it again, I would likely make it a comparative analysis because I think that like in order to fully understand legal systems and how they actually impact the people within them, it's really important that you actually compare 2 different legal systems. But then I think that I would either add the US, or I think Singapore is another really important case study to consider. Singapore, very similarly to Hong Kong, is extremely constrained in space, and so they also have a live-in law, but I found that they have even fewer laws to protect workers than Hong Kong. So I think that like a comparison of these legal structures in both countries would be really beneficial. I'm going to add one more. I think that I was also considering talking to the children that are cared for by these migrant workers. And actually, the people on this panel have been talking about this so much. But I ended up not actually being able to, for the first being their children. And so there's actually an IRB protocol that prevents you from speaking to children. And so I considered also speaking to what I called former children. So kids who are now grown up. But I know we're all former children, but particularly former children who are raised by migrant domestic workers. So if I had the extra time, I would also probably want to speak to them.
For me, it would probably be refugee women who came to the US as single mothers, because that came up very briefly in one of my interviews. And obviously, and this happens a lot more than we assume, because obviously the applications to the US is so complex, so time consuming. So if one person in the family can go, they will go first and get resettled first. But that also brings up a myriad of challenges that the system no longer considers or currently considers. And so I think that'd be really interesting to see how we can tailor or expand resources to include single mothers, because more of them come to the US than we assume, and the system kind of forgets about that.
Yes. If I had more time, I would love to explore like a longitudinal study of maybe migrants who are in the process of migrating to the United States. So they're in Nigeria right now, and they're, in the process of coming to the US. So I'd ask them if they had family here, are they moving in with family? What avenues are they utilizing to get to the US? I think that'd be really interesting to kind of see what the process itself looks like from the perspective of like it happening in the present day. In addition to that, I think it might be helpful or useful to kind of interview second-gen migrants as well and kind of discuss their perspective with Nigerian migration within the community, because there's a lot of transnational community when it comes to Nigerian migrants in general. There's a lot of societies of Nigerians coming together. So I'm really intrigued to see what that looks like from an outside perspective, but also an inside perspective as a second-generation migrant.
Wonderful. Lots of good ideas for you all to take in the future, should you desire. Anyone in the audience have some questions for our panelists? You have one over here. Behind.
This is a question for Iola and Quinn. How are you two able to connect with your respective migrant communities in your projects?
Okay. So for me, since I am like very much a part of the Vietnamese community, that was very like easy because I frequented the same spaces they did. But for the Somali communities, it was much harder. I had to reach out to all these different community organizations, which, you know, Minnesota has a lot of, so I'm very grateful for that. And then I kind of snowballed after that because I found one woman from a community center, but then she introduced me to her best friend, who then introduced me to their nieces, their daughters, other aunts and stuff. And so I actually, for the Somali community, I had to kind of color code them based on their familial relations because it happened more often in my Somali population, like interview population, than my Vietnamese population, because I was able to just kind of pick at random because I knew so many of the people in the Vietnamese community in Minnesota.
Similarly to Quinn, I have, extensive background with the Nigerian community, both here in Rhode Island and also in Virginia where I live, and also in Nigeria as well. So it was really easy for me to just tap into the communities, whether it was church communities, Nigerian churches, or Nigerian organizations like Nigerian Women of Hampton Roads, for example, and other organizations. I was able to find people to interview through those means. And from there, I also snowballed and asked them if they knew anyone who might be willing to talk to me about their experiences as well. It was a bit harder to find people from the older generations, but through just talking to other people, I was able to, gain access to those individuals and interview them as well.
Hi, Sabina. First, thank you all for the really fine presentations. And I have a question for Sabina and then maybe for Tabitha. I couldn't help thinking of the headline, U.S. aid supports prostitution in refugee camps, flinging across my... And then on the other side, I couldn't help thinking about the localization debate within U.S. aid, which is sort of how do we make more aid locally administered, and the unease of the local workers in fulfilling the organizational principles. So I'm wondering what narrative you would propose for justifying a local aid program that recognizes sex workers' autonomy and doesn't piss off the rest of the society, and at the same time somehow doesn't end up with the headline, U.S. aid supports prostitution in refugee camps. So it's an unfair question in two dimensions, but I'm curious what you think about.
Yeah, no, I think that is the big challenge, isn't it? And that question gets at a lot of the difficulties that I was finding. I think something that is really interesting that I didn't really talk about was that even though UN and international aid organizations are managing these projects, they're not actually putting them in action. So it does create this really really weird where they're providing guidelines to local actors, and then local actors are implementing them. And I spoke to in Bangladesh, I spoke to a local aid organization there. And I think it's also hard in interviews to figure out if what you're hearing is the person's own true experiences, or if it's this larger organizational mandate. But there was a very positive response to the like ideas of destigmatization and the ideas of like increasing the agency of the refugees themselves. And I think maybe one way to kind of get around the issue that you're talking about is for humanitarian programming not to be necessarily implemented by like host community actors or international aid organizations, but like by the like populations that they're serving, which is really difficult, and then does kind of produce these like headlines where like the international aid community is like critiqued for like giving away a lot of their agency, and then there's kind of pressure from donors as well. So honestly, I don't really know if there's a solution or if that answers your question.
I don't think it's an answer.
Yeah. But no, I think that's really interesting. And it's like a really succinct way of kind of like getting it, like the issue of my thesis.
Another question, Professor Levitas?
Yeah, no, it seems like the live-in law is really the crux of a lot of the issues that you're trying to get at here, and I'm wondering whether the experience of domestics in other contexts without a live-in law, is there any information that suggests that these relationships are a little less different, a little less loaded, a little more open?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's definitely why I ended up focusing on Hong Kong, because you're right. I think the live-in law is the crux of a lot of the problems that I mentioned in my thesis. And so when I first thought I was still going to focus on the United States, which is a country without the live-in law, and I'd say that most countries, I think all countries in the West, do not have a live-in law. And it does suggest that it kind of forms very different relationships, because the number one is that like the number of hours that these workers spend with these children is just far less, right? Even if you spend the entire day working with these children, you're still leaving at, let's say, 9 p.m. and coming back in the morning. So that's an entire night that you don't spend with these children, that you don't spend with these families. And I also think that like when there is no separation between home and work, and so these boundaries are actually blurred between your workspace and your home space, I think there's like both like a psychological and actual physical component to it. So these women, they not only like, as I kind of touch on in my thesis, they feel like more compelled, I guess, to treat these wards like they are their own children, because I guess in many ways like they replicate that situation where they're living with them, they're spending every hour of the day with them in a way that is just not the same in countries like the US.
Any other questions? We probably have time for one or two more. Veronica?
Oh, sorry. A general question. Whoever wants to respond, or all of you. If you had to give one significant piece of advice to a rising senior who is considering writing a senior thesis, what would that be? What have you learned?
I've learned many, many things. So many. I think the main thing, it might seem a little bit silly, but really utilize winter break to the fullest and try to get ahead and read as much as you can, because senior spring is very hectic and busy. This is very like logistical, just like planning ahead. And then the other piece of advice is, I heard this one before I started, is choosing a topic that you can think about, read about for many, many, many hours and not get tired of, and make sure that it's something that really fuels you, because, you know, I'm Nigerian and this is really important work to me. So when I was maybe a little bit tired and stressed during the literature review, for example, I knew that like the importance of this, not just for me, but also for my family members and also Nigerians at large. So that really kept me going.
For me, I have two quick tidbits. One is like find a writing partner. Like we live together, and so like we'll at night we'll stay up until like 3 a.m. together. Like we're not even looking at each other, we're just next to each other writing. And I think, I don't know, building something like that, a relationship like that, is really helpful in motivating you and also keeping you on like deadlines. I think it's really helpful because we tend to remind each other a lot. And then also like just breathe. Like I remember our class, we were like, how can we even write an introduction chapter? This is so hard. Like, no way we can write a whole thesis. And then here we are. And so it's very doable. It's just going to take a lot of time and work. But as long as you enjoy the topic and you have a wonderful like group of people around you and like my peers, I absolutely adore them because we really motivate each other and also give really good critiques and advice.
Yeah, I think my biggest piece of advice is to start data collection early. I think a lot of us, especially on this panel, face this issue, but because we were trying to reach out to people to speak to us, this can take like months.
Yeah.
And this is something that that held up my process and also was probably the most stressful aspect when I couldn't complete it. And so I think that if I were to do it again, I would have started like months beforehand. And the second thing I'll say is just to echo what Quinn was saying, is just to really rely on kind of the communities and networks of support around you. So like the people in your thesis class, the people on this panel, then of course all of my friends, many of whom were in the audience today, who wrote with me, helped supported me, and really just made this process what it is. So.
Yeah, I agree with everything that everybody has said, but I also think something that was interesting to me was that the process was both like easier and harder than I thought it was going to be. Like things that I thought I was going to have a lot of trouble with, like formatting chapters and like understanding what a thesis was supposed to look like, were really simple, especially because of our seminar. But then like there were things that were definitely a lot more time consuming than I had imagined. And the other thing that I would say is like perhaps this is a little bit biased, and also because of this panel. I feel like it's okay to say, but like I really, really enjoyed the like data collection and like qualitative interview aspect. And I think like to me, that is what shaped my experience of this thesis the most. And so I know that people who did like quantitative theses really enjoyed them as well. But I recommend this. So.
And we had one more question over here.
Okay, yay. First off, congratulations to you all on such excellent theses. I've been in like classes with all of you, so it's just been amazing seeing kind of your growth trajectory over the past few years and like creating really excellent bodies of work that answer a lot of really important questions in this field. I feel like that last question was a really good end off, but I was really curious, Tabitha, with your thesis, you were talking a lot about experiences and like relationship dynamics between the migrant domestic workers and the actual wealthy mothers who are recruiting this sort of domestic labor. And you mentioned like sort of these sorts of workplace boundaries being crossed, kind of muddled, and also jealousy that like mothers experience when like migrant domestic workers actually build relationships with their children. Do you have any information from your interviews kind of how these sort of migrant domestic workers responded or kind of were resilient in those moments where a lot of times their agency was really under attack or violated by the actual mothers recruiting their labor?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I touched on this very briefly, but it was really interesting to me how these migrant domestic workers actually responded to the jealousy that they were faced by these mothers, right? There is not much I will say that they can often do, but I will say that they often had to negotiate these relationships with the children in order to protect themselves. So the one worker told me about how like when children would come up to her during the night, so when the parents were also around, they would kind of like shove them away or like not spend as much time with them as maybe they had wanted to, or maybe they would during the day, because they were looking to protect themselves from the parents almost. And so they didn't want to form this relationship in the eyes of the mother where like they might be closer to the children, or where they're forming a relationship that is too much like mother and child, or like these boundaries are muddled, like you said. And so I think you get at a lot of different points, but I feel like I don't have time to cover them all. But I think that like that was like one of my most interesting findings, is how workers like almost because of this were forced to like manage this other like external like emotional response, as well as actually what like is considered the actual labor of their job.
One more question. Yep.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys so much. That was just really informative. And I couldn't help but like see each of you were talking about the importance of local communities or just belonging to communities. And that actually reminded me of Bianca's thesis on the need to or the importance of belonging. And I was wondering for specifically, actually for Ayola specifically, have you seen any trends or a relationship between whether like the level of belonging or being a part of a community, specifically in Nigeria, if that has any impact on immigration trends? Yeah, that would be my question.
Yeah, so just to clarify, being in community specifically in Nigeria, okay, if that shapes, like if people decide to leave or not?
Yeah.
Yeah. For most of my findings, the community aspect that did shape migration was like transnational like communities in the United States. So whether they had family members abroad or friends abroad, I think that really impacted as a pull factor to coming to the United States, because that person was their source of information gathering and just kind of assurance when they came to the United States. It would stay with them and get started. I didn't see that being in a particular community in Nigeria necessarily impacted whether or not one migrated. But I will say that for most of the migrants who come to the United States, most of them are from the southern region of Nigeria, as opposed to the northern region of Nigeria. But it's not necessarily community groups, but more influenced by ethnic groups.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your excellent questions. And thank you to our panelists. Congratulations. You'll all notice that you have an honors cord in front of you that marks your achievement of honors in the IAPA concentration. Very excited for all of you. Please wear it proudly at graduation. And congratulations to all of our honors students. Yeah, I see some faces. I said this morning, but I had to scour the internet for pictures of everyone. So apologies for the outdated photos.
Oh my goodness.
But before we adjourn and head to the reception, I just want to take a brief moment to thank the community that has supported these students in all their endeavors this year. Faculty advisors, I have your pictures too. Faculty advisors and readers, we deeply appreciate your generosity and your time and energy that you've put into these students. Our faculty moderators throughout the conference, we appreciate your time. Anita, Nestor, and Michael, Christopher, who are floating around, they have made this entire conference work behind the scenes, and they deserve a huge round of applause. And of course, all of you here who have supported your friends and your family members along their thesis journey, and much more than just today. So congratulations to all of you too. This is an effort that is built off of your support. And finally, we have some students who would like to come up and say a few words of appreciation themselves. Come on.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking around these last 2 days. As Dr. Pangborn said, thank you to the incredible team that made this all possible. But we want to extend a special thanks to Professor Claudia Elliott, who is retiring right now at the end of this year. And we have a couple words of thanks that we wanted to say. In my opinion, the IAPA thesis is the hardest undergraduate thesis to undertake here at Brown. It is by far the longest. In terms of writing, we do a lot of writing, we do a lot of reading, and we do a lot of trying to figure out what we are contributing to greater academic literature. We do a lot of data collection and interviewing and synthesizing. And Professor Elliott guided a team, a class of students in the fall through an incredibly rigorous and enriching academic endeavor that tested the limits of really what we can accomplish and what we're capable of. And you were available whenever we needed you to answer questions on weekends and late at night, to read things and to provide salient and topical edits and suggestions. And most importantly, we knew that you really, really cared about what we were writing about and us growing as scholars and as students and as human beings. So thank you so much, Professor Elliott.
Truly, Professor Elliott, you instilled in me a real drive to want to make this thesis good and to want to work hard at it. And every single Wednesday from 6:30 to 9 p.m. was motivating throughout this entire process. I just remember really, really early on when I literally had no clue what I wanted to argue or to do. I emailed you in a panic before the first chapter was due, and you booked a room in the Watson with a whiteboard, and we just figured out what my argument was going to be. And that was incredible. The amount of support that you provided to our cohort is seriously immeasurable, and you're really the heart of this entire program. I mean, you started the honors program, you kept it going, and fueled all of us throughout what has been just a crazy, tumultuous, and difficult, but also very exciting year. And we really, really owe all this to you, and our theses are dedicated to you and everything that you've done for the department, to this program. So thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be up here because as a senior now, I'm thinking back on my 4 years at Brown, and I have to say that Professor Elliott's thesis seminar is maybe hands down the class that I've learned the most in at Brown. I was impacted so much over the course of our thesis seminar, and already after 3 short months, I can look back at the tangible difference in my writing. It is sharper, it is more clear. I'm a more careful and detail-oriented editor when I'm looking over my work. And our thesis seminar was a crash course on thesis writing, but it was also a crash course on research and thinking more generally. And I'm so grateful for that. I know that I will take the lessons I learned and the skills that I learned in that class throughout my future career. And we all truly appreciate your conscientiousness and deep dedication towards helping us improve so much. And I know that we are also impacted, and I know that we're not alone, and that over the course of your career, and especially over your time running this thesis program, you have impacted countless students similarly.
Yeah, just building on the kind remarks of my colleagues, I will say that Professor Elliott had this kind of prophetic wisdom about the things that she would talk to us about. You know, when we were kind of hearing her advice at first, it all sounded very distant, it all sounded very far away, but quickly, I think we all learned that she really did know what she was talking about, and she was really right all along. And so I think that having you as kind of a support foundation for everyone is something that we all kind of took comfort in. As everyone has already mentioned, you know, knowing that we can reach you no matter what, and knowing that you will be there to support us no matter what was extremely meaningful. And I'm not going to tarnish the good name of the rest of my thesis class, but certainly for me at least, kind of prodding me along in times when I might not have been working so hard proactively was definitely something that I appreciated about the thesis seminar, because when you first start with this undertaking, the page count is just this very vague thing that you don't really think about. But I think that through your encouragement and through your kind of excitement about this process, we all kind of secondhand got excited about it as well. And you really pushed us along in the times when it really did matter. So I think we're all extremely grateful to you for that. So thank you.
Professor Elliott, my thesis was very unlikely. And you somehow found the possibility in just looking beyond what is there and always asking questions that just absolutely opened up the world of not just research here at Brown, but just even how I understand the academia and intellectual curiosity and just life, of how do you ask questions. And I noticed that even one of the most impactful interactions I had with you was when we just began, before any of this started, was when we were juniors, and we came to the thesis sort of info session, and the level of detail and the level of just care that you had, not just for what we produced, not just for the papers that we made, but for how we think and how we interact with research, how we interact even with each other, was very impactful. And I thank you for changing the way that I see the world. Really, thank you so much.